There's an event from World War II that I've never really seen discussed, which is called the Percentages Agreement. And I think it's one of the great examples of realpolitik or political pragmatism that I've ever seen. So, what is the Percentages Agreement? Towards the end of World War II, Churchill and Stalin met each other. Roosevelt was sick at the time and he probably wouldn't have gone along with it, in which they were deciding spheres of influence. Which countries would be in the Soviet sphere of influence, what countries would be in the Western Allied sphere of influence. And in one of the most fascinatingly blatant examples of international great power politics I've ever seen, they literally, Churchill wrote on a paper the percentage influence in the different countries, slid it across the table to Stalin. Stalin marked it up and made a couple changes, and then they mutually agreed upon it. So the idea was that they wanted to divide up the border countries, or rather countries in Eastern Europe that the Soviets had occupied or could possibly occupy, because there was a lot of questions at the end of World War II, particularly when it came to border countries. What was going to happen with Germany, Austria, Yugoslavia, Greece, Bulgaria, the various countries that were at least somewhat in between the two great powers, or rather the Western power bloc on one hand and the Soviet Union on the other. And I have to give Churchill a lot of credit for this one, because he went in basically with nothing at this point in time. Bulgaria and Hungary had been overrun by the Soviet Union. Romania obviously had been completely overrun. Yugoslavia, I think both sides were invading it, but it was more the Soviet Union was in a better position. So basically what happened is Churchill went in there and he talked really high. He's like, we want 50% of Hungary, even though we haven't occupied any of Hungary. We're going to even claim part of Romania, which doesn't even make sense. What does even 10% influence look like? So basically, this whole thing was just smoke and mirrors, the goal of which was to prevent a civil war from happening in Greece and preventing it from becoming communist. And the end result of this is Churchill basically ceded most of these, with the sort of exception of Yugoslavia, to the Soviet Union in exchange for them staying out of Greece. So he traded something he didn't have for something that he really wanted. So I have to give him credit for that. But I do admire just how flagrant it is. How they literally wrote on a piece of paper, okay, this is going to be mainly Russian, this is going to be mainly Western Allied, etc. And I think it might be time to take another look at this, because we've had numerous conferences where the world's been divided up between great powers in history, be it the Congress of Vienna, Treaty of Versailles, unofficially various times during the Cold War. And I think it might be time to just take another look at the whole situation. Since the end of the Cold War, I think the US has viewed itself as being the sole superpower, and that basically the entirety of the world, except for maybe the territory of Russia proper or China proper, is within its sphere of influence. That is, all of Latin America, all of Africa, all of Europe, and all of Southeast Asia is considered to be a bit more or less American influenced or American aligned. This obviously isn't the case anymore, and as American power is in decline, and it appears that Russia and China are in the ascendancy, I don't think America can make the pretense of being, maybe perhaps it's still the sole superpower at the moment, but it doesn't have the money and reach that it once had. So the question is, much like Churchill, maybe what America needs to do is come to some sort of understanding with Russia, China, and Iran to preserve the countries in its sphere of influence that are actually important to it, in exchange for giving up on countries it really doesn't have any influence in anyways. For instance, the US really doesn't have any influence in Venezuela or Bolivia, obviously not Cuba. So why even make any pretense to have influence over them, or that the Monroe Doctrine is still relevant in the sense that we're going to eventually have regime change in Venezuela? You also have stretch goals like the war in Syria, Iraq, the whole Afghanistan thing. Basically places where the US, I don't think, really has that much in the way of interest in, and isn't in a realistic place to assume control or something like that. Like, there are a lot of allies that are very useful to the US, both economically, politically, and militarily. Like, Japan's a useful ally, South Korea is, Australia, New Zealand. Um, Most of Europe is at least somewhat useful in an economic sense. I think in the Middle East, Jordan and Egypt were historically, at least since the end of the Cold War, fairly pro US, and they're probably okay allies to have. Obviously, there's the greatest ally of America. You can't see me doing the air quotes, but the greatest ally of America, Israel. But also, there are some countries where I think the U.S. could maybe still save its influence or save its close relationship with, namely Turkey, Thailand, the Philippines, that sort of thing. And then there's some countries that are probably just going to be split influence or strong enough to be somewhat on their own and maintain good relations with both sides. India just isn't really going to be in the US sphere of influence anymore, if it ever really is. So the goal is to acknowledge that it's closer, probably at the moment, to Russia and China, but that they can still have a good relationship with the US, good economic relationship, good political relationship, that they can do business together. There's other places like Burma, which obviously at this point in time is very much on China's side, despite the attempts at regime change, and maybe just giving up on that, giving up on. I'm not sure. Indochina's weird. I don't really know where Vietnam is politically at this point in time, because I've seen both things, that it's reconciled with China or that it's moving in a pro US direction. I'm not entirely sure, but it's kind of an open question. So just acknowledging countries like Brazil are probably going to be neutral or are going to have split influence between the two sides. Some kind of agreement with Russia that Ukraine is going to be in its sphere of influence, but in exchange, Romania, Poland, Bulgaria, and some of the other traditional Russian sphere of influence countries have been ceded to the US. That some areas are going to remain demilitarized, kind of like Mongolia. I don't know. To me, that just kind of makes sense. It's better to accept reality and maintain the parts of your sphere of influence that are actually useful to you and you actually have a realistic chance of holding on to than continuing the delusion that all of the world is at your beck and call. This is maybe kind of a side note, and I'm maybe getting a bit off topic, but I really don't want to see the collapse of America or the complete end of NATO or the West's complete implosion. What I would rather see is the abandonment of the democracy project, the abandonment of neoliberalism and neoconservatism, and the return to a more pragmatic view of the world, wherein alliances are viewed as a good thing, cooperation is viewed as a good thing, economic trade and that sort of thing is viewed as a good thing, but the actual attempts at regime change just mostly stop. Like, you don't try to just shit on Turkey to force them to become a liberal democracy. If Poland or Hungary wants to implement illiberal policies, you stop bothering them. Now, I obviously continue to believe that the main internal thing I support is ensuring the freedoms and tolerance of Christians within a country. But I don't think that's really an issue in most of the countries America is allied with. Ironically enough, probably with the exception of Israel. But what I would prefer is the US accepts that some of its allies or just don't want to be liberal democracies. It stops trying to push it on them. It stops trying to, in countries it has good relations with in Africa, just shove stuff on them that they really have no desire to implement and just adopt a pragmatic approach to it. I think basically that's really what I want, is just an acknowledgement of reality, both in terms of the attitude taken towards other countries and the attitude towards global spheres of influence. Because once again, a lot of these countries, if the US loses influence in them, who cares who controls Myanmar? Who cares? Like, there's nothing they can really do about North Korea at this point in time. Let China and Russia deal with that. There are some places that I think are salvageable, or places that, could be within both multiple spheres of influence. Like I said, countries that are not controlled by the US or China, but can do business with both of them and can be something of a neutral broker. This, by the way, isn't a map I made, it's a map I found. Of the ones I could find, this one seemed to make the most sense. It's far from perfect, but I think it largely represents, with the exception of maybe Indochina, how the global alliance structure works at the moment. Although Indonesia, I think it's more pro West than pro China. It's very hard to say at this point in time. But that's my thoughts on the matter. A formal, through some sort of new international organization that encompasses the US and its allies, either a successor to NATO or some sort of like international super happy freedom league of justice super friends, or some sort of, well, we have the Eurasian Union, but some sort of like looser thing that would include China and France, and either have a formal or informal agreement with that sort of thing. But that's my thoughts on the matter. I don't actually want the US to completely collapse. I'd prefer if it would abandon, like I said, the neoliberal neocon thing and kind of go back to how it was maybe near the beginning of the Cold War, where it was more tolerant of illiberal regimes. But that's my thoughts on the matter. Hope you found it interesting. God bless, and we'll talk more real soon.